attention, fans of philosophical weightlifting. I wanted to make a very special announcement. I have created a Patreon page for the podcast. It's a $5 subscription. It will help support the show and it will help support me as I make my way through grad school and continue producing all of the great content that we know and love. That is patreon.com/philosophical weightlifting. Please subscribe. Again, it helps support me and it helps support the show. Now let's get on to the podcast. My name is Joshua Gibson, and you are listening to the Philosophical Weightlifting Podcast, a show dedicated to promoting a message of critical thinking as it pertains to strength training, nutrition, and well-being. This is done through interviews with experts, high-level athletes, coaches, and people heavily involved in strength sports and athletic development. Pull up a chair, grab a coffee, and let's get on to today's podcast. Hello and welcome to this week's episode of the Philosophical Weightlifting Podcast. My name is Joshua Gibson and I'm joined today by Paul Comfort. How you doing, Paul?
I'm good, thanks. How are you?
I'm doing well. I've read your work and I've heard your name and I've probably mentioned you here and there for some reason, but I didn't expect the accent. I don't know why. So it was a slight surprise when I popped onto the link and heard that. So maybe you can fill me in and then fill our listeners in where you're at, what you're currently doing, and then we can kind of get into like what led you to getting into your current position.
Cool. Yep, no problem at all. So I'm currently full professor of strength and conditioning at the University of Salford. If anyone doesn't know where Salford is in the UK, it's on the outskirts of Manchester. So everyone will know where Manchester is from the football teams and stuff there. So it's on the outskirts of Manchester. I've just started my 17th year at the university, so been there quite a while. So no matter what I say about it sometimes, it's obviously a pretty good place to be. So I've been there 17 years, been at a few institutions prior to that, sort of getting my career off the ground initially. And luckily, all the way through, up until very recently, I've always been involved in coaching and consulting with a range of different teams as part of that role. So, for example, when I started at the University of Salford, I had 3 mornings a week. I was working with one of the local rugby teams. And then we also have partnerships with a whole range of other teams, whether that's cricket, which a lot of listeners in America will think, what the hell's that? It's a weird version of baseball is probably the easiest way of describing it. Whether it's rugby league, rugby union, football. Luckily, we've got all these partnerships with the clubs. So it means our work can be applied and we try and pull together our research questions to answer the questions that a lot of practitioners want, so they are impactful. You still need to do some of that stuff in the lab, some of the almost cellular-based side of things. But if it's not working in the real world, then you're going to struggle. So you need to do the real world stuff, in my opinion, and then almost reverse engineer it and try and out, right, why is this working? How could we refine it and make it better with some of the more lab-based research?
Yeah. Do you think that perspective is one you had? And I'm assuming, and you can kind of fill us in as well, that you became interested in getting your doctorate degree and then being a part of like an institute, like university or institution, so that you could research and understand sport performance better, or monitoring sport performance or athletic performance better. Does that mean that you have a pretty extensive background in sport?
I suppose it's not as extensive as some people. I've never worked full time within sport. So while I was doing my undergraduate degree and my master's degree, I was working as a personal trainer, because back then in the UK, strength and conditioning wasn't a thing. Basically, people were referred to as fitness coaches, and that was it. And most of it was fitness. There wasn't a lot of strength work being performed back then. But it got me really intrigued. I actually got, I think it was my 20th birthday, somebody bought me the Essentials of Strength Training and Conditioning, the NSCA's text. And I read through that and thought, why am I not covering some of this in my degree? So that got me really interested in the strength and conditioning side of things. And working in a gym-based environment at that point, I was working on 2 extremes of the continuum. It was either wealthy, overweight businessman that wanted to get in shape and then would go on vacation for an extended period of time and come back overweight again. or it was athletes that wanted to do better and knew that to do better they had to, be fitter, faster, stronger, but didn't really know how to do it. So that sort of really got me inspired in those areas. And then as I finished my undergraduate degree, I had more questions than I had answers, so I wanted to go on and do my masters. Did my masters, and then started working in a university. Again, sort of linking a bit of lecturing with some a little bit of sort of strength and conditioning work with local teams, the university sports teams. Don't get me wrong, university sports teams in the UK are nothing like they are out in America. So it's very very amateur level even now in most places. Yeah, and then as that progressed, I just ended up with more and more questions, which really made me think, well, okay, if these questions aren't being answered, we need to start answering some of these research questions, and try and provide that information for practitioners.
Yeah. And on the flip side of that, I guess if you didn't necessarily start in athletics, did you have just like an interest in kind of like the scientific process, or trying to figure out, you kind of mentioned earlier on, when we were talking a little bit about your expertise, you talked about athlete testing, and you talked about like, okay, um, we could understand all these things, but like what really pans out in practice, what really affects performance or creates performance or allows us to better understand it. Did you always seem to have that kind of framework of thinking that led to, well, I should really know more about this or understand more, and then that led you down the academic route?
Yeah, I think there's so much information out there. Even now, when you look back through a lot of the different textbooks, especially some of the ones, some of the work from people like Sif and Verkhoshansky and those sorts of people. Um, Most of that was anecdotal. Some of it based on science, but not necessarily based on research. It was based on sound theoretical principles. And it's only now, really, that some of those concepts we're looking at and going, oh, yeah, they work. And they've been evaluated appropriately, very objectively in research settings, rather than, that almost case study approach from what happens in the real world and observations. And that's brilliant to see. So I think I've always looked at the theoretical concepts and thought, well, these are the principles, but how do we know that this works better than this? And I suppose that's part of the problem is we still don't know some of the answers to some of those questions. We know, simple increases in maximum strength and force production capability will improve performance in pretty much any athletic task, especially in athletes where they're not particularly strong, which you definitely get with sports like soccer in the UK. And there's a huge bang for your buck there if you increase their strength. But what we don't know is what's the most effective and most efficient. If you look across the research, you could say, more novel type things like flywheel type training is going to work. Suspension training might work. Heavy loaded resisted sprints will work. Weightlifting works. General strength training works. But actually, which is most effective? The problem is we're probably never going to do that study that compares 10 different methodologies, because you'd need 10 groups of athletes plus a control group. And this is just not going to be feasible. And we don't generally program in that way either. So again, there's a disconnect sometimes. You look at the research where someone's gone just plyometric training, just ballistic training, just weight training, as in weightlifting training, just
Yeah.
general strength training. Nobody programs in that way. But it tends to get broken down across the research. So yeah, it's that sort of, I suppose, led it to some extent to the way that I try and do the research and think, well, let's look at it from a real world perspective. Does it work? The way people are doing it, does that work? It might not be the most controlled way of conducting some of those experiments, but people can apply that in the real world. If I try and control every single variable during a training intervention and then say to a team, look, it works, you get improvements of X amount over X amount of time, they'll try it and it won't work in the same way because they can't control all those variables. And sort of going back to your question a little bit more in terms of the testing and the monitoring, I think everyone makes the assumptions that the testing and the monitoring, the use of force plates, and even things like sprint testing is really easy and really basic, but everyone does it differently. And that,
Mm.
again, as you start digging into the research, you start thinking, hang on a moment, there's loads of different ways that people are doing this. Why are they doing it so differently? Surely that testing should be standardized. Everyone should adopt a similar protocol in terms of conducting the test, analyzing the raw force time data, if it's a force plate you're using, interpreting that data in the same way, using the same variables. And actually, as you look through the literature, you suddenly start thinking, wow, some of this is a bit of a mess.
Mm.
And to be honest, I've been critiqued from, some of the professors at our university, saying, why are you just looking at simple methodological studies? Why are you comparing 5 different methods of this same test? What's the point? But that's really important. There's no point in me doing a randomized control trial if the methods to evaluate the individuals pre and post aren't particularly good. They're not reliable. The measurement error is huge. So we need to know if we slightly vary the testing procedures. That's even as much as cueing the athlete. Are you cueing them to jump high? Are you cueing them to jump fast? That completely changes the characteristics you get. So it's really important that we know that across a whole range of tests. And unfortunately, we don't know that for some of the tests at the moment.
Yeah. Where did you start your research? I say journey, but like, where did you start initially? What were you looking at, and then how did that kind of snowball into what you're doing now?
Hey, what's up, weightlifters? Danny here, founder of Onyx Weightlifting Co., a leather accessories company specializing in weightlifting gear. In our shop, we make gear that doesn't get in the way of your performance because we understand that hitting lifts requires your full attention. Our straps, wrist wraps, and belts are designed to be comfortable and reliable, so all you need to do is make lifts. Thanks for listening to our friend Josh's podcast. You can continue to support him by visiting our online shop at onyxstraps.com and using his code PHILWL. That's PHILWL at checkout. See you on the platform.
It was, most of it really was sort of opportunistic. It was, as I said, answering some of those research questions. Primarily, I did a little bit of research, a few reviews before I started at the University of Salford. Once I started here, that was where it really took off, because we had all those different team sports available that we could collect data with, identify what their performance characteristics were, almost generating relatively low samples, but some normative data, what's normal at this level of competition, etc. And then, observing their training practices and then evaluating that appropriately. So what happens during pre-season in the first 6 or 8 weeks in season? How much do they improve? If there's an increase in strength, which we're hoping for pre-season, does that relate to an increase in sprint performance, or a reduction in sprint time, or an increase in sprint speed? So we started looking at a whole range of areas there, and then sort of tried to think about, well, how do we refine this? How do we make this more effective? How do we plan it and be more strategic with what we're testing? And that sort of was where we were looking and saying, well, okay, people conduct these tests in totally different ways. They use totally different variables. We've done it a certain way. I'm comparing it to other research which has been published, but they've done something slightly different. So am I fair to make that comparison? Will it make a difference? Is it simply they used a different testing method, or they calculated certain metrics from force time data in different ways? And that really led to us sort of going, right, we need to be far more strategic with this. And then at the same time, we've had some really good and sort of inquisitive students, from undergraduate bachelor's degrees right the way through to PhD students, who have posed questions to us where we've gone, wow, we should know that, but we don't. And one perfect example there is going through a load of weightlifting exercises with our students, explaining, the benefits of actually performing a clean or a snatch, or a power clean or power snatch from the floor, going from the hang, going from mid thigh, and all the different variations there. And looking back at all that research from Inoka, Hakkinen, Garhammer, that showed, the highest forces, rate of force development, velocity, acceleration from the second pull position. And one student just said, so why do we bother doing the rest? And we were like, okay, yeah, really good point. But all of theirs was from weightlifting. So you've performed the first pull and the transition or double knee bend. So we don't know what happens in isolation with some of those. And that led us to just say to one of the coaches at one of the rugby clubs, right, can we come in and do some testing in the mornings? We were doing some work with them pre-season, focusing on their technique for weightlifting exercises, because they've all come in from different clubs, some from the Southern Hemisphere, some from local clubs, all with completely different training backgrounds. So we were doing some sort of weightlifting technique work with them in the mornings before they do their proper strength and conditioning work. It was literally 45 minutes with one group, 45 with another, getting students involved. And I just said, look, once, for those that are competent at these techniques, can we just stand them on a force plate and actually assess the force time characteristics during these different movement patterns? And that was where some of the weightlifting research that we've done an extensive amount of really started. It was that one question from a student and us looking into the literature and saying, wow, this hasn't been done. So we're making certain suggestions and we're teaching certain things which hypothetically sound correct, but are they? And yeah, we went from there with it, and that sort of spiraled. And now we've done dozens of publications on that topic area.
Yeah. In kind of following that line of thinking, one thing that interests me, and I'd be curious to hear your take on, is with the variance you're going to see in technical proficiency between team and individual sport athletes and then weightlifters, how much does that change the effectiveness and then the application of weightlifting movements and weightlifting derivatives? And then I'd kind of like to follow that question up then with like, how would load be dictated to improve certain characteristics? Because you're looking at it more as a training tool. With weightlifters, it's the sport. So you're looking at improving qualities, but it's also like improving the thing itself. So with the technical variance, how much does that change the return? And then we can kind of talk about like, okay, well, knowing that, how do we manage load or manage prescription to then get as much out of it as we can?
Yeah, and I think the technical proficiency and their competency does make a huge difference. And there's also a huge amount which you can't tease out within the research in terms of their preference. So when we're working with athletes, some of them love certain variations of the exercise, and you see them hit it with real intent. Mm-hmm. Others don't like, and then they might not like an alternative variation, and you see them going through the motions. So you definitely have to put the science to one side sometimes and put that research findings to one side and go, hang on a moment, when this person's doing it, either they're not technically competent or they don't put in a maximal intent, we're not getting the appropriate training stimulus from that. So that's really important to bear in mind. With people that are complete beginners, and again, using the example of those rugby players, when we were getting people coming from the Southern Hemisphere to the UK to play rugby league, they were pretty much all competent at weightlifting. They could all perform a power clean and a power snatch as long as their shoulders weren't so beaten up and injured that they could get into that catch position. And that's another reason we looked at some of those pulling variations where you don't catch, because some of the athletes just cannot get into those positions because of the injuries. So, in those situations, we can start with those individuals and we can progress them on pretty rapidly. Whereas some of the people from the UK had come from a background, they might have come from an academy setup where they'd only really been doing powerlifting or more bodybuilding style training, really focusing on hypertrophy. And their movement patterns were terrible. Which is why I give that example earlier of, some of those athletes were coming in and just doing 45 minutes purely of technique work. And it would be a light bar, maybe 40 kilos. They're all strong individuals. So we're not going to go with an empty bar because they'll just, anything that you try and do and get it up to the shoulders is going to be an upright row. It's going to be upper body dominant. So a bit of weight, so they've got to use the lower body, starting off with a light load. And then in terms of progressive overload for that, just simply looking at their technique. And if their technique's good and we can add more load over the maybe 5 or 6, 7 weeks of pre-season with them, when they're, complete novices, just slowly and incrementally adding a bit of load, as long as their technique didn't break down, and them start to compensate to make sure they could perform the tasks, we just progressively add load to it. And with those complete novices, it was a case of, right, you can front squat with, that sort of correct positioning, not a front squat like you see in the bodybuilding magazines and stuff, in, Arnold Schwarzenegger's encyclopedia. So in that front rack position, that they can do a hip hinge type movement, they can deadlift. If they can do that, we can teach them pretty quickly to start in that second pull position, rapidly extend up and catch. We can hip hinge down to the knee and perform a hang power clean or a hang power snatch. If they can do an overhead squat, and actually normally within the first session, we would have them performing mid-thigh power cleans, hang power cleans. Some of them, if they were struggling with posture on the hip hinge, it would be hinge down to the knee, pause, hold it there, correct the technique, make sure the posture is correct, and then go from the knee rather than that hip hinge down. And, over a matter of weeks, you'd see the loads would increase. Now, that doesn't mean that they were actually improving their force time characteristics, getting any stronger. That's probably just technique for the first 5-6 weeks that they're working. However, There are a couple of studies out there that demonstrate that just doing about 20 minutes of that type of movement patterning prior to doing your general strength training actually not only enhances weightlifting performance, but enhance their performances in jumps, etc., more than just doing the standard resistance training exercises. So there is going to be a lag. You're not immediately going to get a benefit for somebody who's a complete novice, but over a period of time, and especially as you can start adding load to those exercises, because it allows you to move with maximal intent throughout the full range of motion, you get a training adaptation pretty rapidly. But again, that goes back to my earlier point that they need to be moving with intent. If they're not doing that because the weight's too heavy, or they're being super cautious with the movement, or they don't like it, then that's problematic, and they may not adapt. But again, that's going to take a period of time, depending on those individuals, to really get them moving with that max intent. And again, sometimes they're not going on max intent because the weight's so light. So we need to put some more weight on the bar.
Yeah, I actually had that experience yesterday. I was working with a kid because I'm the strength and conditioning coach at a local high school. And yeah, I kind of say this jokingly to him, but he moves so slowly through every exercise. Every exercise looks like it's one speed kind of from start to finish. And you just try to emphasize this idea of like, it's an all out effort. The concentric portion is an all out effort with the correct technique. Once you hit kind of the end range of the eccentric and you're transitioning, you should dynamically return back to the start as correctly as possible. And to see him turn that on, it's like, okay, that's what we're looking for across exercises, is I can see you flip a switch of like, I'm working to move the load as quickly as I can. And I think with the weightlifting derivatives, yeah, that makes sense too, because you're trying to emphasize certain qualities. And if you're not emphasizing kind of that rate of force production, right, you're not going to benefit as much as you can. One question I have that'd be a little more theoretical, but I've given it some thought because I've been in different weight rooms with different teams and kind of seen like variance in technique. And with cleans and with snatches, I'll see that some athletes won't make contact, against their thigh or against their hip. So they won't touch the bar on the way up. From your perspective, is that like a non-negotiable aspect of weightlifting technique when you teach athletes how to perform them? And almost hypothetically, from like a force production and like rate of force development perspective, would we see a big variance if we add in the bar body contact with a variation of not making contact with the barbell? Because I've thought about this a lot. Like, is that one of the most important things to teach athletes? Or if they just kind of can't, I mean, can't is not a great word, but if they aren't able to wrap their head around it, is it something we can just kind of bypass and then focus on other aspects of the movement?
Yeah, I think that that's one of those questions where the answer is definitely going to be, it depends. Because I've seen it numerous times, not just with team sport athletes, but even with weightlifters, where they're being taught to really make a forceful contact. And if you start doing that and it becomes excessive, you start thrusting the hips forwards early, messing up the bar path, the bar travels too far forwards, then you have to, excessively extend backwards to pull it towards you, or you jump forwards after it. So if somebody's doing that, that's excessive. No, that needs to be addressed. And also then, if you assess people, and we've only got a little bit of data on this from people that have done it, naturally when we've tested them, is if you look at the force vectors, there's a huge horizontal component coming in then when they're thrusting the hips forwards and not a vertical. And whether that's for weightlifters or other athletes, we really need to be focusing on getting that, rapid force into the ground with predominantly a vertical direction. If you look at the bar path, there's going to be some anterior, posterior, forward and backward movement that happens. We can feel that with the change in the weight distribution in the feet. So that can be problematic if you start hitting it forwards with the hips. However, you also get the same if people aren't getting the weight transitioning back towards the heels, and once they get to that the bar around the knee. If that's not correct, the bar's already in front of them anyway. So the bar path, instead of starting and moving back towards you on that first pull, if it's going away from you, you've got a problem straight away. Exactly the same as hitting the bar and bouncing it off the thighs when you get your hips through too early. Because the trajectory of the bar is that it's already moving forwards. So it causes the same problem. So you've got to get that trade-off between the two. Now, personally, I'll point out to, especially when we're doing this with our students and they're complete novices in most cases, if you can see, a red mark on the thigh is almost like a very, very light graze by the end of a session where they're learning the technique. I'll normally point out, right, this is great. I know you're keeping that bar close to you. But then we'll start checking and make sure the bar's not traveling forwards. If they haven't got that sort of that redness on the top of the thighs, then we'll be looking and saying, well, okay, is the bar too far away? Let's perform this again. How does it look? So it really should almost just skim off the thigh. You shouldn't be hitting it and knocking it forwards. If it's in front of the thigh and it's not making a very light contact, then the trajectory of the bar could be incorrect. It's one of those things with team sport athletes where if that's very subtle and the bar almost just goes vertically and the bar path isn't as we would like to see it, I'm not necessarily too worried. If it's going forwards, there's a problem. If it's coming back and they're thrusting it forwards, there's a real problem. And that's the same even though with team sport athletes, if they're performing the movement really well, but they're not doing an obvious shrug at the top, so you're not displacing the bar as high as you would like them to, well, I'm not worried about the force production through the trapezius for those individuals. So I'll focus on everything else first. Once everything else is good, then we'll get them to make sure they shrug, because that way they can lift a heavier load, etc. So it's identifying, where are we going to get the most improvements from this? And again, if they're not really touching their thighs each time, as long as they're not thrusting the bar forwards or the bar path isn't correct, then I might focus on something else. It definitely does make a difference in terms of bar path, though. And that's something that you can, we don't need a lot of technology for that. You can just get out your smartphone, whatever smart device tablet you've got, and especially with the tablets, it's easier. You can play it back to the athletes straight away, show them what it should look like, show them what it really looks like, and hopefully get them to improve. It's something you need to look at. But again, it's not something worth obsessing over if it makes the technique deteriorate.
Well, and I know with the power lifts or the slow lifts, there are strength standards that are maybe a little more common or commonly known. So you can have a reference point of, we should be able to do roughly this. And you can say, maybe to get as much out of this style of training, if we could get to this strength level, this performance level, considering like individual differences, we'll be in a good spot.
Yeah.
With the weightlifting derivatives or the classic lifts, I'm not aware of that data, or I wouldn't be aware of like numbers. I wouldn't be aware of like goals or like outcomes we would be trying to achieve. Besides, from my standpoint, it's use the best technique possible, the best technique that I can coach you to.
Yep.
And then the weight's going to kind of come on as the program plays out. I mean, I can't program you to hit as big of a clean PR as I can a squat PR, because there are just so many variables confounding it in especially a team sports setting where you have 20 to 30 people at once performing the same movement. It's like highly technical and you're kind of making rounds. From what you know and what your experience has shown you in the lab and then also on the in the weight room, what sort of performances or performance levels should we look at with athletes with weightlifting movements and their derivatives to understand if we're kind of maximizing the benefit? You mentioned light loads, and from a technical standpoint, that's great. But from kind of maximizing the return, I'm sure we want to work on putting some weight on the bar, but it's like how much, how often, and then how does that change the adaptations?
Yeah, I think if you've got athletes who are already strong, so using those examples of rugby players, they're normally pretty strong. Most of them will be getting up to, if they haven't got injuries so they can't squat, most of them will be back squatting around about double body weight. Some are a little bit less. Some of the backs are maybe 1.6, 1.7. Some are way above double body weight. In those individuals, really, I'm looking at them being, classing them as technically competent when they can power clean body weight, because that's nowhere near their maximum strength level in a squat, and actually classing them as then quite strong in that sort of technique if they're up around the double body weight squat once they're at about 1.5 times body weight on the power clean. And again, that does come down to that sort of technical proficiency. We need enough load on there to give them a true training stimulus. But for those individuals that aren't particularly strong, so again, if we use the example of football players, soccer players, then in that situation, almost any load with good technical ability is good, because you're very unlikely to get them to be, squatting heavy. A lot of the time they avoid bilateral exercises, and they'll do split squats, step ups, those sorts of things. So that makes it a little bit more difficult. So for those individuals, it really is just a case of, normally I end up with most, without sounding derogatory, I'll class most soccer players as not being well trained. They haven't got a good training history in terms of strength. Fantastic in terms of aerobic performance for most of them. Strength is very limited. They may be good as they come through the academy system, but 17, 18, when they sign for a professional team, especially at the high levels, they're playing frequently. They're looking, thinking, well, this guy earning, £250,000 a week is not doing this. Why do I need to do it? So it tends to drop off. So with those individuals, getting them doing anything like that, and even using some of the really basic versions of the exercise, like the mid-thigh power cleans, jump shrugs, hang high pulls, and things like hang high pulls work really well with those athletes because they don't have a strong upper body. So they have to use their legs. If I do it with rugby players, their legs stay flexed and they just do an upright row because they've got really strong upper bodies. So again, you've got to have a bit of context there. So yeah, really you're looking at least body weight for the strong athletes, those that are squatting, 1.5, 2 times body weight or higher. Body weight on a power clean is demonstrating to me that they're okay in terms of the strength levels and they're technically competent. And then we need to work beyond that to try and get them up to about that 1.5 times body weight on the power clean. And I actually think I think that's similar to the standards, not exactly the same, similar to the standards that Dr. Dan Baker used to do with Brisbane Broncos. And, we've got to make sure that they can shift the load that's appropriate for them. So again, go back to the soccer players. If they're not particularly strong and they don't squat heavy, we're just going to have to incrementally increase that load. And it becomes a problem. But, you can see if that load's moving fast and they need more weight on the bar. You can see if they're not putting the effort into it. And again, that's one of the things, going back to that point about intent. If they're doing some of the really simple variations, so with some of the rugby players, they might be doing hang pulls or mid-thigh pulls and no catch in there. Now, with some of those, they'll go through the motions because they haven't got to displace the bar high enough to catch it. So then we load it more and more, so that they have to put in an effort. But for others, if we get them to do a power clean, they cut the pull short. They get part of the way through that extension and they're dropping to try and get into the bar and catch. So then we either need to add load to that to force them to fully extend. That doesn't always work. Sometimes they just fail the lift. Or we add the load, add more and more load on if they're not fully extending. And sometimes we'll almost do it as a complex. So you might do 2 or 3 pulls from mid-thigh or hang pulls, and the final one you make them catch. So they add in that intent, or you do pull on 1 rep, catch on the next, pull on 1, catch on the next, and also try and get the athletes competing as well where you can, and that tends to really help and get them into a position then where they will put in more intent. But it's that trade-off between what we would like to do with them, and then, as you said, you can only coach them to a certain level. We're not expecting team sport athletes to be weightlifters. We can get them pretty good, but there's always certain things where, especially as we add the load, if they're panicking about dropping under the bar and catching it, they cut the pull short and, they then fail the lift that way.
The mission of Weightlifting House is to bring weightlifting closer to the fans, athletes, and coaches of the sport. They're able to do that by supporting the Philosophical Weightlifting podcast. And myself, I've been working with Weightlifting House for over 6 years, and I've nothing but gratitude and respect for Seb and the entire team. If you use code PHILWL, that's PHILWL, you can get 10% off your purchase through Weightlifting House. Order today, support Weightlifting House, and support the podcast. Yeah, and I think, before I kind of got into this space of doing S&C, you would hear that athletes aren't weightlifters, like team sport athletes, individual sport athletes aren't weightlifters, so you can't hold them to the same you shouldn't hold them to the same standard. But I can kind of take a step back in the weight room sometimes, and especially if it's a power clean from mid thigh, everyone looks really good.
Yeah,
You know, most people look good. I would say even from above the knee, it's a little more hit and miss. From the floor, it's can be really hit and miss. But
yeah,
from the right position, I think most people can look good and move well and understand the movements. I think it's almost, it feels like it can be a bit of a cop out, and that's why I almost kind of ask around and question, and for like people like yourself, what's the expectation? Because when I'm in there, it's you're going to move as well as I can coach you to move, and I've coached weightlifters to top 10 at nationals, so I should be able to do a pretty good job. And
yeah,
if I can't do that, there's something wrong with the way there's something ineffective about the way I'm coaching. So to hear like, well, make a concession here, make a concession here, just get them moving the weight with intent. And it's like, I understand that, but I also would like to see them moving as well as possible, because assuming they're American football players, um, they're going to get really strong, which means their cleans could be really strong, which means they're going to be able to rapidly produce a lot of force in a
yeah,
singular effort. So let's prepare them to be able to do that versus saying, they're going to get something out of 40 kilos. It's like, that's only going to last so long. They're only going to be untrained for so long before they're competent enough to kind of take the next step. So I think having this mindset of maybe coaching to quote unquote perfection, but realizing like you're not going to get that close, but you're going to get closer if you expect really quality movement than if you don't.
yeah. And I think that, that's part of the reason I said, we need to look at, almost thresholds of what's acceptable, what's not. But in terms of adding load, progressive overload is a pretty simple principle to apply. So, I get asked all the time, well, what if my athlete can't catch? Especially with some of the rugby players, they can't get into this position, they can't get overhead. So what do I do? How do I judge it? It's like, well, just add more load.
Mm.
Don't add load every single session, but incrementally add load. Look at how quickly the barbell's moving. Look at the posture and the position they're in. Look at their technique. Can they cope with more load? If they can, add a little bit more. And if you do that week on week, over a block of training, suddenly you've created progressive overload.
Mm.
And then, you might change to a slightly different variation. But again, same principle, just keep incrementally adding load to that barbell as long as their technique is within those thresholds that you've set. And that's perfect. And I think going back to your point where people say, oh, well, they're not weightlifters. I make a point with my students, and I've been teaching some stuff abroad in Italy recently to physiotherapists, where I'll turn around with them and say, right, we're going to do some basic exercises. We're going to do squat variations, hip hinge movements, including things like overhead squats, etc. And we'll do that for a little bit. Then I tell them to go away and practice. And then I'll come back normally 6 weeks later and say, right, by the end of this day, and we do 2 hours in the morning, 2 hours in the afternoon, by the end of this day, you'll be competent at performing a mid-thigh power clean, a hang power clean. Power clean from the floor for most of you will look okay, but it won't be as good as you work up the chain. We'll do a hang power snatch, etc. And as long as you have the range of motion to be able to get into these postures, you'll be able to do it. And I'll always say, look, people say it takes too long to coach. I'll put myself on the line, and I will guarantee I'll be able to coach you to do this within that time frame for people that have never done it. So my view is, and this might upset a lot of coaches, but if you can't coach weightlifting exercises, you're not a good coach. It's not that difficult to go through a sequential approach, making sure they can perform, as I said, a hip hinge movement, a front squat, an overhead squat. And those only need to be shallow if you're doing a power clean or a power snatch. And then coach those athletes to move effectively. It doesn't take long. It doesn't take a huge amount of time. That can be the first 15, 20 minutes of your standard workout as a warm-up. Have a look at the amount of people that are spending time doing prehab, pre-activation exercises, very, very low intensity, which aren't going to be achieving anything unless you are injured. If you're injured, those types of activities, perfect. When you're not injured, if you just get up and go and do some squats, you do some lunging patterns, all of the lower body musculature is going to become activated. We've stuck EMG on people doing some of those, low-level therapeutic style exercises. And if you're not injured, it doesn't do much. Bodyweight squat, emphasizing, externally rotating through the hips. and keeping that correct posture does more than that. Load them up with some extra load, you've got a higher level of activation. So also when people say they haven't got time, they're focusing on the wrong things, because we know that increase in strength in people who aren't injured, increase in strength is the best way of reducing injury risk. It improves movement patterns just by simply getting those individuals stronger. So, I think it's one of those things where people do make a lot of excuses. And I always tell our students and anyone else that I'm working with, if you aren't experienced in weightlifting, start introducing it into your exercise. When you go to the gym, you perform it. Go along to a weightlifting gym, go along to some, a CrossFit gym where you've got a weightlifting coach there, and get them to give you a few sessions, give you pointers, even if it's once a week. And as you improve and you go through all the mistakes you'll make when you're trying to perform those lifts, you'll realize the ways to improve other people. Go and watch weightlifting coaches coach, because I know now I still pick up things. If I go to a conference and there's an elite level weightlifting coach coaching certain components of the weightlifting exercises, I'll join in as part of the practical, or I'll stand by and watch if there's not enough room for everyone. And you always come out away with a couple of things where you think, wow, why have I never cued it that way? That works. That's really simple. I've overcomplicated it. And there's always one or two things that you take away.
No, and that's a great point. Actually, yesterday, I had the football team in the weight room, American football, and the one of the coaches, he always stands pretty close to me because he's trying to pick up on how I'm coaching, what I'm cueing, movement expectations and standards. So if I can't make a session or for whatever reason, he's also working the room and helping.
Yeah.
He can coach well, and he'll come up to me with questions of when someone's squatting this way, what would you cue? What would you do? And I kind of would explain my rationale and give him a few words. And he's like, oh, really? I never thought about that. And, I think he's going to be a great S&C coach just from observing, asking good questions, seeing, how effective coaching can change performance. And, he's just in the weight room with me. So I think to your point about kind of getting in, shadowing someone, getting some experience, and then also like having the theory and kind of the background to underpin it. That sounds like a really effective approach. And then one question extending off that, you mentioned lunges and squats, bilateral squats. This concept of sports specificity, before I got into strength and conditioning, I thought it was something different. And I think that's probably the way it's marketed and probably the way it's talked about. And you hear people talk about their different systems. So it doesn't feel just like good training, good weight room training. It feels like something that is special and deserves its own like category. To you, what is good strength and conditioning training? Like, what's a good strength? And I guess let's approach this just from the weight room, but how does a good strength coach approach it, given all of the fluff that exists and can cloud what that actually looks like?
Okay, I think you teed me up for that nicely there, in terms of ignore the fluff. Fancy stuff that you see on social media, etc. Now, ignore it, or the majority of it. Do the basics really well. It always goes back to progressive overload, and the more movement specific the task becomes, and that's what some people class as sport specific, looking like the movement in the sport. The more specific that becomes, the harder it is to create progressive overload. So, DeLorme hit on something back in the 1930s and 40s when he came up with the system that he was using for rehabilitation. And unfortunately, some people still don't grasp those basic concepts of, either progressively adding load, or decreasing the repetition range and increasing load even further to make sure that we have that sequential approach. So you've trained, the hypertrophy, there's general strength, the maximum strength, moving on to speed strength, etc. So the first thing is do the basics, and do the basics really well. Make sure the athletes can move well, but also identify why can't they move well. Are you trying to get them to do a task where they haven't got the range of motion, or they haven't got the strength? So if you've got a very mobile athlete, I've seen weightlifters who are definitely mobile, not be able to perform something like a pistol squat.
Mm.
And then people saying to them, well, we need to focus on mobility, we need to focus on strength. And I'm sat there thinking, hang on a moment, look at what they lift during a bilateral task. Do they need to be able to do a pistol squat? They've got the range of motion. Maybe they haven't got the balance, the proprioception, etc. But do I need to train that with them? No, probably not. But then I've also seen that within different team sports where people are saying with youth athletes, until they can do that sort of task, then we won't progress them and do loaded exercises with the barbell, etc. Well, if I'm doing a pistol squat, that's like me putting 100 plus kilos on my shoulders and doing an arse to grass squat. If I'm not strong enough to do that, you can do as much balance proprioception training as you want. You can work on mobility as much as you want. I'm never getting out of the hole because I'm not strong enough, because it takes a huge amount of force to get you up from that position. So I think, you've got to do the basics and do the basics really well. And start with progressive overload. Make sure that they can perform the exercises appropriately, competently, and confidently. And again, within the appropriate threshold of what you class as good technique, because it looks different with everyone based on their anthropometrics and their mobility. So do the basics really well. Don't try and get really fancy with your programming. Either create overload from higher volumes or higher intensity. If you're after hypertrophy, we've got to increase the volumes. General strength, you could go with volume or intensity, so put that load up. Maximum strength, we're probably going to be focusing more on progressively and incrementally increasing the load, because that's the adaptation we're trying to drive. And also use a sequential approach to it where it's appropriate. It will be appropriate throughout, but if you look at in-season training in team sports, you're probably not going to go back and revisit lower body hypertrophy because it's too fatiguing.
Yeah.
Whereas a lot of people think, oh, there's a huge amount of weight during maximum strength training, that will cause more fatigue. It doesn't. The volumes are dramatically lower. So it's programming these things appropriately, avoiding some of the stuff that looks really fancy, but also then, and this is a discussion I've had with a couple of people recently, monitoring and evaluating your athlete's progress. So you set a 4, 6, or 8 week block of training. You're expecting certain magnitudes of improvement. If you achieve that, great. You can move on to the next block you'd already planned. If you didn't achieve that, you shouldn't be going on to that next block. You need to modify it. And if, especially with the more novice athletes, you go, wow, I expected X amount of improvement, I've got 50% more, you then need to revise what your plan was because your athlete is further ahead of where they were. And that leads to some individualization, which, if you've got a large squad of athletes, can be a little bit trickier to manage depending on the number of strength coaches. But we need to use objective assessments to say, well, are they improving? Are they improving in what they're doing in the weight room? And, sometimes, especially with novices, we don't need to go away and do a whole load of testing regularly because we're going, look, I don't need to go and do an isometric mid-thigh pull. This person's just put 30 kilos on the back squat. They're stronger. Okay, let's keep going. And you'll be able to see sometimes in their sport, are they jumping more efficiently, more effectively? But as they progress, those magnitudes of adaptation become much, much smaller. So then we start need to refining it, or if we want to look at, did they improve rapid force production? Okay, we probably need to go and do some other type of test. So it's making sure that we've planned things effectively and appropriately. We stick with the basic concepts of applying progressive overload, a sufficient amount of variation within their program so it doesn't cause them to be bored and them not put in intent. And then regularly monitor and evaluate that and amend our plan based on whether they've achieved what we set out for them to achieve within that previous block of training.
Yeah, and what you described, I mean, you said a lot of really great stuff that I probably will love to go back and listen to after we finish recording this. But what it sounds like is that load, like weight on the bar, is generally king. And then, you also have range of motion, which I say would be like the companion to that. So you're looking at how can you move the biggest load, the most weight, the biggest load through the biggest range of motion, and that's like caveat. You have to have the correct positioning. So with a back squat, it's like torso stays relatively vertical. A lot of the movement happens at the knee and the hip. There's not a lot of deviation from fixed points once you start. it's like if you can do that, you're going to get a really big return because the muscle has to produce a lot of force through a very large range of motion, which makes that quote unquote specific adaptation very general.
Yeah.
That when that general adaptation is applied, it can be applied to specific contexts and then allow for performance improvements because, as you mentioned with weightlifters who can maybe perform weightlifting movements and lift a good load but can't do pistol squats. I've trained weightlifting for like 10 years probably, and a lot of people are like, can you do this, can you do that? And it's like, well, I've never tried, but let's see. And then I end up doing it, and it's like, well, it's because all that general training allowed me to like specifically do certain tasks
Yeah.
well enough. It's not pretty, it definitely isn't comfortable with respect to a pistol squat. The knees don't seem to like it, but like I can do those things, and my jumping's improved quite a bit, and all these other aspects of what would be called like sport specific performance or more sport specific movements have improved a lot, and I've never done any of it just because it doesn't make sense to me to do a pistol squat or a ton of jumping when I'm doing snatches, clean, squats, pulls, and my workout's already like 2.5 hours. So that completely makes sense to me, and I guess it's kind of getting that into the head or heads of athletes and even coaches to some extent of, it seems basic and it seems like quote unquote powerlifting or weightlifting, but that's just good training, and we can sprinkle in more plyometric exercise or more kind of movement specific exercises, but they can't squat body weight, or they can't squat like 1.5 times body weight. So let's just kind of wring this dry before we start to add in a lot of stuff that's going to detract from the main work.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, we've got examples of loads of different athletes that we've worked with where if you look at the rugby league and the rugby union, they are generally pretty strong. Some of them could get stronger comfortably. Some of them, it's going to be a lot of hard work to increase that strength even further. Based on the performances we've seen with some individuals. And for them, they'll probably need to focus more on the more ballistic and plyometric type movements, or for some of them, aerobic capacity.
Right.
That could be the limiting factor, depending on how the coach plays them in the sport. If we look at football players, last pre-season we tested over 800 football players. And apart from the goalkeepers, they were all weak. Not a single one of them you would really classify as being particularly strong based off relative isometric mid-thigh pull performances. Goalkeepers, brilliant. So most of the athletes, and it really is the majority of them, I'd say it's about 95% of people we tested. If we just did basic strength training with them, you'd get a huge bang for your buck. After they've learnt and probably spent the first 4 to 8 weeks really becoming competent at performing your basic lifts with a decent load.
Yeah.
Not a load that's allowing 15 repetitions, but actually, progressively and incrementally increasing that load. They do loads of ballistic and plyometric training anyway. That's built into warm-ups, is what they do on the pitch. They don't need a huge amount of that. Whereas with the goalkeepers, they were generally really strong. The reactive capability was quite good, but that probably needed to be improved more because that's a real key performance indicator if you're the goalkeeper. Yeah. You need to be able to react to that stimulus and dive in whatever direction. And I think you've got to go back to, what adaptation are we trying to get? Are we trying to improve maximum force production? Are we trying to increase rapid force production? But we know that relative force determines acceleration, and then relative impulse determines the velocity that you achieve at the end of whatever that task is. So if you look at it as a counter movement jump, if we can produce a higher relative force over a given time, we end up with a higher impulse. You leave the ground at higher velocity, you jump higher. But you can apply that to any sporting task. But we're limited with time. Any sporting task has a limited amount of time, maybe with the exception of powerlifting, although you're going to get to some point where it becomes isometric if you take too long. So we need to be able to produce a really high impulse over a short duration. So we can't increase the impulse by increasing time. We have to increase the impulse by generating more force. And there's so much research out there, some of it's single joint, some multi-joint, that shows that if you just get stronger, that in itself will increase rapid force production and impulse during a given task. There is some component of, we also need to get them used to expressing that as rapidly as possible. So, we've got data on athletes where they're really good on something like an isometric mid-thigh pull. They have a great counter movement jump. So I tested somebody about 2 weeks ago, probably 3 now because it was before Christmas. Isometric mid-thigh pull, 50 newtons per kilogram, or above 50 newtons per kilogram, but within that range. Counter movement jump height of, I think it was 56 centimeters. When they tried to do a rebound task, they couldn't get above 30. That tells me their rebound capability is a limiting factor. But then we also had somebody else that was the reverse. Rebound capability could actually do a reactive jump and jump higher than a counter movement jump. So it's like, wow, this guy's got some springs. He can move really, really well.
Yeah.
But he can't do a particularly good counter movement jump, and he's really weak. So what do we need to work on? And it's probably his ability to perform the counter movement jump, which is underpinned by him generating a high enough force. So he had a really long time to take off, going through a big range of motion, and couldn't really, unweight quickly, hit the brakes hard, and then rebound out of it. So that's underpinned by strength. Whereas if you think about a really reactive task, a pogo type task, a 10-5 reactive jump test or a drop jump, but a drop jump, not a depth jump, is very, very ankle dominant and relying on the elasticity of the tendons more than anything. So that athlete was great at the reactive component, but awful at the others. So there are examples where we go, right, we need to improve rapid force production, but it's during a different movement pattern. And that's when we really need to start doing those types of tests. So, right, is it strength? Is it maximum force production? Is it their ballistic capability during something like a counter movement jump? Because that's so easy to coach. Is it their reactive capability from a task? Now, reactive capability, if it's weightlifters or powerlifters, you probably don't need to bother. But for most other sports, there are a huge amount of reactive activities where they need to be good at those. So once we've got a good level of basic training, then we can go, well, okay, is it maximum force production? Is it ballistic? Is it reactive? What do we need to focus on? And we'll keep changing that emphasis. That's a continuum. And there'll be a block of time where we go, do you know what? Everything's really good down here with that ballistic and reactive capability. Let's focus on strength for a while. And then other times we'll go, do you know what? Their strength is far better developed than those other characteristics. Let's maintain that. Let's work on these others. But that's where people don't tend to do that. I've mentioned that we tested a hell of a lot of soccer players pre-season. I know some of those strength coaches actually went away and manipulated and changed the training programs based on that data. Some definitely didn't, because when we went back and retested, I looked at the data and went, oh, they're still weak. Okay, you definitely didn't do any proper strength training there.
Yeah. Yeah. What's funny is like during that, you said something about like, well, this person needs to get stronger. And I had this Doc Stone kind of flashback in my head listening to one of his presentations. He said almost the exact thing verbatim. And it's, it's one of those things where I think the more people hear it, the more they understand the importance of it and how it underpins so many different qualities and aspects of performance, and also like reducing injury risk. And I think that's why it's championed so much, and which is a nice breath of fresh air coming from a strength sport background where it's, strength matters. It's not about, complexity and uniqueness and mimicking what's done on the field or on the court or wherever. As we kind of round out the conversation, what are you currently working on, or do you have any projects going that your interest is piqued by and that you're looking to kind of provide some answers to different questions?
Yeah, there's a range of different things. We're still looking at some of the different weightlifting aspects and doing some of that actually in weightlifters as well, to try and identify a little bit more about, well, what are those key performance indicators and key characteristics they need to develop? How does that compare between weightlifters and team sport athletes? Because that hasn't been done. That's going to be a slow burner though, because we obviously need enough team sport athletes that are competent in all of those lifts, including snatch, etc. So we're still looking at the weightlifting side of things. Also looking at a lot of different methods of assessing force production characteristics. So counter movement jump's been done. We really know what we should be doing with that type of jump testing. We know what we should be doing with isometric strength testing in terms of isometric mid-thigh pull or isometric squat. Those reactive jump tests at the moment, they've all got limitations. If you do a drop jump, nobody falls from the height of the box. it's plus or minus 20%. So if you've got a 40 centimeter box, you can lower your center of mass and fall from as low as 32, or you can actually jump off or plantar flex and step off and go from as high as 48 centimeters. So if we're doing that for longitudinal monitoring and not evaluating that, we're not comparing like with like. But there's certainly, in terms of the automated software which is out there to calculate performances from force plates, that's not built into any software. So that's not useful for practitioners at the moment. You could do a 10-5 reactive jump test where you do a counter movement, 10 reactive rebound sort of pogo jumps. But the problem is everyone does their best jumps on the last 5. So why do we do 10? Can we get away with 5? Can we get away with 3? We've been looking at a counter movement rebound jump, so a maximal effort counter movement jump, making sure it's within about 5% of their normal counter movement jump height, because it's not always quite as high because they're thinking about rebounding. Then doing that reactive jump when they land, so doing that sort of pogo type jump, because the counter movement jump height is pretty consistent across a season in athletes. So if we use it for that monitoring, we're going to be okay, because the jump height on a counter movement jump doesn't generally change. But there's still a limitation with that. What about longitudinally, with developmental athletes whose counter movement jump height improves year on year on year? With, again, not comparing like with like then, so that's potentially problematic. So we're looking at some of those areas, and do they tell us distinct qualities? Can we improve it? Can we do it differently? And then also looking at some of the single joint isometric testing that people have been doing. So there's not a huge amount of research looking at things like the ASH test, the isometric hamstring tests, isometric plantar flexion, and they all use different protocols. So we're then going, hang on a moment, are they comparable? Is it the testing protocol that makes a difference? The use of a foam pad on the knee during, a bent knee plantar flexion test, or a big foam pad across the shoulders when you're doing it. Well, that compresses, and I can go through full plantar flexion if I try and do that test. So it's no longer isometric. So what can we do to improve that? So we're looking at some of those areas, along with looking at microdosing strength training, or subdividing, your normal. If you think about in soccer, they could play 3 games in a week. How do we add a sufficient training stimulus in without inducing fatigue? So can we go with, instead of 2 40-minute sessions in a week, can we break that down into 15, 20-minute sessions so that they induce less fatigue? The same fatigue across a week, but one session then isn't going to leave you feeling sore or fatigued when you go on the pitch with a coach. And also then, if they've only managed to get in 1 training session in a week from that traditional approach, and then it gets cancelled for whatever reason, you've missed all of your training. If you've split that, 40-minute session into 2 20-minute sessions and you miss 1, you've only lost half of that planned training volume. So we've got some preliminary data on that, which is quite interesting and quite promising, especially for team sports. But we need to really delve into that in a lot more detail to see what the real benefits are. Is it just, they comply more and they actually perform a higher volume of the planned training, or does it enhance the quality of each training session if they're not prolonged?
I think the most impressive thing was how well you could compartmentalize and then communicate exactly what you're working on across so many different subjects and research questions and methodologies. So props to you for having that categorized so well. If people are interested in reading more about what you just mentioned, or, the body of work you've done over the last, 17 years, at Salford, where can they go to find that? And if they want to reach out and talk about it or inquire further, where can they contact you?
They can either email me, that's p.comfort@salford.ac.uk, or on Twitter and Instagram, it's paulcomfort1975.
Awesome. And if everyone listening enjoyed the podcast, enjoyed this pretty deep conversation about the importance of strength for team sport and individual sport athletes, leave a good rating for the podcast. That does help it grow. Share it around on your favorite social media platform, and make sure to tag Paul and I. That way we can share it as well. You can follow me on Instagram at Josh_PhilWL. You can go to teammeta.com for all of your weightlifting and powerlifting coaching needs, and we will catch you guys next week on another episode of the podcast.